So we just received a pretty massive update with the most recent patch for retail WoW in that Dragonflight is now going to be in legacy loot mode for all raids and dungeons. And very specifically with one of the dungeons, this allows you to farm some incredibly rare items pretty quickly now. Now, if you haven't heard of legacy loot mode before, essentially as expansions get older, they get turned into legacy loot mode, which at a baseline just means that if you go run a raid solo and you kill a boss, you would get all of the loot that would normally drop in that raid if you were doing it when it was current and you had a full raid. Let's say you go do an old raid on Mythic and you kill a boss and it drops like 5 items instead of 1 that you could potentially normally get. So essentially, all the loot that could drop from defeating that boss in a dungeon or a raid does drop now, and you just get all of the loot. So that's kind of the base version, so you can go run this old content and get a lot more loot to farm up the cosmetics or other things from those raids a lot more easily. And usually alongside this, they will over time change a lot of the fights in these dungeons or raids, so they're much more easily soloable. So if you've ever gone and tried to farm like raids from the most recent previous expansion, and there was a fight that maybe has like a mind control or something, and a mind controls you as the only person in the raid, it just resets the fight. That's usually something that would be fixed when it turns into legacy loot mode. And another really important reason why having legacy loot activated is because once you go run these old dungeons and raids, you can now get Transmog for any of the classes in the game. So any armor types and any weapons. Because if it's not in legacy loot mode, meaning it would be a more current dungeon or raid, when you go kill that boss, you can only get things usable by whatever class or spec you're currently on. So if you're playing a priest, you can't go get like a two-handed sword or something. But when it's in legacy loot mode, you can get any drops that dungeon or raid offers. And that's obviously incredibly important for transmog hunting. But one of the dungeons from Dragonflight has some incredibly interesting items you can now very easily go farm that I think is going to make it one of the most sought after farms in the entirety of the game when it comes to transmog and even mounts. And that's going to be the mega dungeon, Dawn of the Infinite. And there are some incredibly cool things you can go farm in here, and you can actually farm transmog from the entirety of the game through this one dungeon. You can even get items that are no longer obtainable through this dungeon. It's actually really cool how it's done. But before we go into that, we should go over the items you can actually just get from the bosses that are normal gear drops within this dungeon, because there's some really cool stuff. First off, you just have the normal armor sets and weapons you can get from this dungeon that are Dragonflight themed, that aren't built off of any other weapons or items from the game's history. So there'll be cosmetic armor sets for every different armor type. So your plate, your leather, your cloth, and your mail. And they look pretty decent. They are recolors of sets you can get in other parts of Dragonflight, but you can get those pretty easily. Then there are weapons for almost every weapon type that are also themed and colored like the armor set. So if you like any of that stuff, you can pretty easily get them from the bosses. But then there are 3 different weapons that are very unique and themed from other pieces of the game's history. So first off, and probably the most sought after one, is the updated HD remodel of Gorehowl. So Gorehowl being the big two-handed axe that's famously wielded by Garrosh, and you've been able to get different versions of Gorehowl throughout the game's history. The first one being just Gorehowl from Karazhan back in TBC, and this version is essentially the HD remake of that old original version. You can obviously get like the corrupted version from Siege of Orgrimmar and everything, but this just being the HD remake of the original Gorehowl is going to be super sought after. There's so many cool transmog sets you can go and make this new version of Gorehowl. This is probably going to be the most sought after thing from this dungeon as a whole, and it's just really cool. I definitely recommend going and getting it, especially if you play a warrior. Then we have another two-handed weapon that I think is a lot less known than this Gorehowl, because this two-handed weapon is an intelligence mace, so very few classes or specs could actually go get this during Dragonflight, obviously primarily being a holy paladin, and that's because this is an infinite corrupted version of the Light's Hand two-handed two-handed mace. That's a pretty widely known mace from earlier in World of Warcraft, specifically with Legion. The Holy Paladins get that as their artifact weapon. This is essentially the infinite corrupted version of this mace, and it has these really cool animated like vibrations coming off the sides. Just an incredibly cool looking two-handed mace, and it obviously has the higher graphical quality of being in Dragonflight. So again, another really cool two-handed weapon. And then finally, we have Quell Zaram, the High Blade of the Lion. Now, this isn't an HD remake of a previous weapon. This is essentially just a recolor of Quell Dalar, which was famously obtainable from Wrath of the Lich King. This is just another recolor of that one-handed sword. But from what I've seen, this is one of the most well-liked one-handed swords in the entirety of World of Warcraft. And I do really like the recolor of this one. So if that's another weapon you want to go and get, this is definitely going to be a pretty sought after transmog piece as well, especially if you're, say, a paladin, because I think that fits really well with a lot of paladin transmogs. But outside of the actual gear drops from the bosses in this dungeon, we have the most interesting part of farming this dungeon, and these are quantum items. To farm these quantum items, you have to farm this dungeon on mythic difficulty for these to actually drop, meaning your characters can only do this once per week. But because this is now legacy loot mode, you can very easily go farm this dungeon on much lesser geared characters. Even characters that are transferred over from, say, Legion Remix, which have like a 102 item level, should be able to go and do this dungeon as well. And if you need more gear, you can go pretty easily farm up gear from the Midnight pre-patch right now. Go watch my last video to see how to very easily farm all 121 item level plus gear from that. So you can go through that very quickly if you get stuck on the one boss that's kind of difficult in this dungeon. But these quantum items come in a few different forms. First off, you have the much more rare drop of the Quantum Corsair, which this is essentially a mount drop. It has around a 2% drop chance, and all of these quantum items only drop from the final boss of the raid. So this is going to be the more rare one that you don't get a bunch, but once you get this Quantum Corsair, it will give you one of the possible 17 mounts this can give you, and it will always give you one you don't have. Now this one is a bit more unique compared to the other quantum items we'll go over, because again, it's a low drop rate and it only has 17 mounts that can currently come from this. A bunch of them are super rare. Like you can get the super rare mounts from Zul'Gurub. You can also get the Panther from Zul'Gurub. You can get the Hawkstrider from Magister's Terrace. You could get Sharkbait's Favorite Crackers, which is another rare drop. You can get the Raven Lord, which is another rare drop. So there are just a bunch of different rare drops you can get from this one item, and there's 17 potential mounts to get from it. I don't exactly know what happens after you have all 17 of these rare drop mounts. I'm presuming when you use it, it just doesn't give you anything. But again, if you don't have a bunch of these rare mounts that can come from this, you're not going to be getting a ton of these Quantum Corsairs to very quickly get those mounts. This is just another really cool thing you can get from doing this farm. Now, the much more interesting quantum items that come from the final boss of this dungeon are quantum armor or weapon pieces. And there will be a quantum item for every different type of loot in the game, so every different type of armor piece and every different weapon. So you can get a quantum head, chest, legs, gloves, shoulders, shield, and then all of the other weapon types in the entirety of the game. And every single time you defeat the final boss of this dungeon on mythic difficulty, you will get one of these quantum items. Like I mentioned, the Quantum Corsair is a rare drop, like 2%. You will get one of these quantum armor or weapon pieces every single time you do this on mythic difficulty. So it's a guaranteed drop any one of these pieces. They are Warband as well, so you can send them to other characters, and that's somewhat important because of how these actually work. So once you get one of these quantum items and use it, it will give you one piece of transmog you don't currently have known. So if you get any of the quantum armor pieces, you can send that to other characters if you want, say, cloth or plate or mail or leather, because they're not specified on the item and they are Warband. So if you go farm this on a plate character and you put it in your Warband bank, you can go then use it on a cloth character and get a cloth piece you don't currently have. You should be able to now get any of the different quantum weapons and learn it, and it should give you a weapon that you don't currently have known, no matter what character that's on. I don't think there's anything stopping you from learning, say, a quantum crossbow on like a priest or something. But where this gets really interesting is the items you can actually get from these quantum items. And if you go to Wowhead and look up these quantum items and look in the comments, there are actually people who have done a bunch of testing on these items, and you can get unobtainable items from these quantum items. And one of the users on Wowhead did a pretty massive test when this was first coming out on the PTR, and some of the items you can get from these quantum items are absolutely ridiculous. First off, you can get ultra rare items, specifically something like the Pendulum of Doom, which if you've never heard of this is like a low level rare item back from vanilla that in retail World of Warcraft right now is one of the rarest drop items. It doesn't look anything really special, but it's an ultra rare item and collectors really want this. Currently, if you go and check on the overall price on US services, Pendulum of Doom has like a 4 to 4.5 million average gold price. So this is literally one of the rarest items in the game that really only collectors want, and you can get it from this. You can also get a bunch of other super rare things like black market auction house items. You can get things like the Arcanite Ripper, the old one. There are even weirdly obtained items you can get, like more specifically, if there are any caches from previous expansions that give you a piece of gear, you can get those. I actually got one of these. It was one of the raid caches from Warlords of Draenor that would just give you a piece of loot out of it that I think had their own appearances. You can also get items that are now unobtainable from previous events. They specifically say that they got one of the Wrath of the Lich King Scourge Invasion events, which was one of the pre-patch events. You can get cosmetics from those. You can even get items that were never obtainable in game, but share the appearances of other items obtainable in game, so there would just be a different ID code even though they have shared appearances. There are even items that were previously in the game that aren't in the game now from older dungeons or raids that were remade that don't have the old version of that dungeon or raid in the game anymore. So there are so many different crazy items you can get from these quantum items, and what's really cool is if you're already a collector or you're somebody that just likes getting a lot of transmog, this will always give you items you don't already have. Sadly though, some items seem to not be obtainable from these, like challenge mode sets or old Naxxramas items, specifically something like Corrupted Ashbringer or things like that, don't seem to be obtainable from these either. So some super cool items aren't there, but there are a lot of super rare, super cool items that you can get from just farming this one boss that is now pretty easy to farm. And on a side note, if you're somebody that doesn't have a ton of gold, doing a full run of this, which includes getting the gold from the bosses, getting the gold from trash, and vendoring all of the items you get throughout the entirety of the run, you can get somewhere between like 2,000 to 3,000 gold. I think it's usually more a bit over 2,000 gold, but if you specifically get a lot of weapon drops, those sell for a lot more gold, so you could potentially get upwards of like 3,000 gold for a full run of this. Now this isn't a super good gold farm, but if you're already doing this, that's not actually too bad of gold just as a side thing when you're pretty much only going for transmogs anyway. And like I mentioned, you don't need super high gear to be able to do this dungeon. Like I mentioned, I have done this whole dungeon on Mythic on a character that was transferred from Legion Remix, so they only have a 102 item level, which is super low compared to what you can just go get in pre-patch right now. But there is one boss within this dungeon that can give you difficulty, and that's the fourth boss, which is a Ridicron. If you're a class that can heal or even shield an NPC, you should be able to do this even with lower gear. If you're a class that can't do that, you may need to go get a little bit of gear because you have to burst down this boss, because pretty early on within the fight, the boss will do this big attack that'll hit your whole group and Chromie, that's the NPC with you in this fight. And if you're doing this solo, you can't soak enough of the damage to not kill Chromie, but if you can heal Chromie up like 2 times pretty quickly in this, you should be able to do it even if you can't outburst the fight. But even on DPS characters that have a single target build, you can do this with lower item level than the pre-patch gear gives you right now. So it shouldn't be super difficult unless you're on a super low gear character, then you may have issues. You may need to go get some pre-patch gear. So with all of that in mind, I think this is going to be one of the most sought after dungeon farms in the entirety of the game now. And because characters are so easy to get up to max level, and especially right now with pre-patch are easy to get to a decent item level, you can just keep bringing more and more characters here to farm this dungeon. Again, you can only do it once on a character per week, so you can still farm this dungeon almost infinitely per week, depending on how many characters you have that can actually solo it. So just incredibly cool, and I definitely recommend doing this if you just want to collect pretty much any transmog in the game. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.